It sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because stealing was hard, that part was almost exhilarating, but because everything else about the life was relentless, brutal, and often outright fatal. Being a thief in the Middle Ages was a mixture of adrenaline, constant fear, and unimaginable discomfort. For someone like Jory, a wiry, clever man with more luck than skill, each day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit filled with spikes and angry guards. Jory had started young, orphaned by a plague that swept through his village like wildfire. He quickly learned that kindness was rare and hunger was a constant companion. His first theft wasn't planned, it was survival. He had stolen a loaf of bread from a market stall when he was 10, his small hands trembling as he stuffed it into his ragged tunic. The baker had caught him, of course, and whipped him across the back, leaving marks that lingered as a painful reminder that the world was cruel, but he had survived. And survival, Jory realized, often meant taking what you needed, whether or not it belonged to someone else. By the time he was 15, he had become adept at navigating the narrow, twisting alleys of the town, slipping unseen through shadows, listening to gossip from drunken tavern patrons and learning which guards were easy to bribe, and which were sharp enough to cut you down for a copper coin. The life was exciting in a desperate sort of way. Every successful theft was a rush, every narrow escape a triumph. But there was a darker side that nobody ever talked about, the constant fear, the filth, the injuries, and the punishments that could turn a small mistake into a death sentence. One rainy night, Jory found himself crouched atop the wall of a manor house, slick stone cutting into his knees, rain soaking through his clothes. He had heard rumors of a rich merchant hiding a cache of coins in a small chest behind the kitchen. The house was well guarded, but Jory had spent weeks observing the patrols, memorizing the timing of the torches and noting the servants who had habits he could exploit. His heart pounded as he dropped silently into the garden, mud sucking at his boots. Every step felt like a gamble. One misstep and he would either be clubbed to death, hanged, or thrown into a dungeon where rats were rumored to feast on anything alive and unattended. As he inched toward the kitchen, he thought about why being a thief sucked so much. Not the thrill, but the constant threat of losing your life or freedom over a mistake. There was no room for error. And even if you survived, society treated thieves as vermin. If you were caught, your punishment would be public and humiliating whipping, mutilation, hanging, or worse. Thieves didn't get trials in the modern sense. They got spectacle, and the spectacle was meant to deter anyone else from following the same desperate path. It didn't matter that Jory was hungry, that he had no family, or that he stole to survive. To the town, he was a parasite, a stain that had to be removed. Tonight, luck favored him. He reached the kitchen window and found it unlocked, a small mercy in a life that offered so few. He slipped inside, careful not to wake the sleeping cook, and located the chest. Coins glimmered in the flickering torchlight. His hands shook as he lifted it, not from greed but from the sheer relief of success. Then came the noise of floorboard creaking under the weight of a guard. Panic surged. Jory's first thought was to flee, but the exit was blocked. He had only seconds. He ducked behind a cupboard, holding his breath as the guard approached, muttering to himself. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the guard moved on, leaving Jory trembling, soaked, and exhilarated. He had survived another night. But it wasn't always so lucky. There were nights he returned with nothing, soaked to the bone, starving, and nursing cuts or bruises. He had been beaten by rival thieves, hunted by bloodhounds, and caught in ambush that left him questioning why he had ever chosen this life. Disease was a constant companion. The stench of unwashed streets, the rotting refuse, and the lack of proper food or clean water made every theft a risk not just of capture but of sickness. A common cold could turn deadly when your body was constantly exposed to damp, mold, and filth. Jory had also learned that human cruelty was far more dangerous than any law. Some nights, he would be betrayed by other thieves, attacked by the desperate, or turned in by a servant looking for a reward. Trust was a luxury he could never afford. Friends came and went, and the few allies he had were as slippery and unpredictable as the shadows he hid in. The life of a thief was lonely, a constant reminder that you were expendable. Just another piece of dirt in the eyes of everyone who had a home, a warm meal, and the protection of the law. Even love was a trap. He remembered a girl named Mara, the daughter of a tanner whose curiosity had brought her into his world. For a brief moment, Jory had imagined a life with her, a dream of warmth and companionship. But she didn't understand the rules of survival in the shadows. She wanted safety, comfort, and predictability, all things that a thief could never provide. One night she had been caught sneaking food to him, and the punishment was brutal. Mara never came back, and Jory never let himself dream like that again. Being a medieval thief meant living on the knife's edge. Hunger, disease, violence, and betrayal were daily companions. But perhaps the worst part was the realization that society had made him expendable. If he was caught, he was no more important than a rat in the gutter. Every theft carried the potential for mutilation, public humiliation, or death. And yet, despite all this, the life of a thief was all Jory had known. It was all he understood. Every risk, every scrape with death, every stolen loaf of bread or pouch of coins was a testament to his survival. As dawn broke over the town, Jory disappeared into the misty streets, clutching his meager treasure. His body ached, his stomach growled, and his spirit was exhausted, but he was alive. And in the medieval world, that was victory enough. Being a thief sucked, but not being alive to steal was far worse. Jory's mornings were never peaceful. He didn't wake to the smell of fresh bread or the warmth of a fire. He woke to damp cold, the smell of stagnant water, and the echo of rats scuttling across rooftops. His body protested every movement, the bruises from yesterday's fight, the cuts from a barroom brawl, the stiff joints from crouching all night in alleys waiting for the perfect moment. But there was no time to rest. Hunger gnawed at him, sharper than any blade, and the town waited for mistakes to punish him. In the medieval world, a thief who slowed down was a corpse before nightfall. Breakfast was a concept he had long abandoned. Food was stolen or not eaten at all. Today, he crept into a crowded marketplace, eyes scanning the stalls, looking for opportunity. Coins jingled in purses, a basket of apples sat unattended for a moment too long, a loaf of bread rested near a distracted baker. Every object was temptation. Every movement could be fatal. He had learned to judge the risk in seconds. One wrong glance, one stumble, one inadvertent brush against a guard's sleeve, and his day could end in a public spectacle that the townspeople would remember for weeks. He targeted a fruit vendor, a plump, complacent man who hummed to himself as he rearranged oranges. Jory's hand darted forward, snatching a small pouch of coins as he brushed past. The man barely noticed, engrossed in counting his produce. Jory melted into the crowd, heart pounding, breathing ragged, feeling the sharp, familiar thrill of survival. It was a minor victory, but every victory mattered. But survival was fragile. The life of a thief in the Middle Ages wasn't just about evading guards. It was about evading suspicion, navigating alliances, and understanding the twisted rules of human cruelty. One misstep could mean a beating so severe he would be unable to walk for days. Worse, it could mean being dragged into the town square, tied to a post, and lashed while the townspeople jeered, threw rotten vegetables, or spat at him. Sometimes the punishment was even stranger and more cruel: knees broken for petty theft, ears cut off for repeated offenses, or branding with a hot iron so that his crimes would be visible forever. Jory knew all this too well. He had friends once, thieves who had laughed with him over stolen wine and bread, who had shared the spoils of clever schemes. But in the medieval world, friends were temporary, and loyalty was a fragile concept. Betrayal was common, often fatal. Jory had learned to trust no one completely. Even his closest allies could turn on him if the promise of a few coins outweighed friendship. One such betrayal had cost him dearly. A fellow thief, a man named Rowan, had lured Jory into a trap, promising him access to a wealthy noble's treasury. The trap was obvious in hindsight, a guard waiting in the shadows, a rope ready to ensnare him, and Rowan nowhere to be seen. Jory had barely escaped with his life, bruised, bloody, and more careful than ever. That night, lying under the eaves of a crumbling building, he realized that the medieval world had no sympathy for thieves. Each of them existed in a constant balance between cunning and doom. Disease, too, was an unrelenting enemy. Water in the streets was contaminated, food was often rotten, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. Jory had seen friends succumb to fevers that seemed trivial but proved fatal when left untreated. Injuries, even minor ones, became life-threatening if they became infected. He had bandaged wounds with scraps of cloth, washed them in cold water, and hoped for the best. Survival often depended on luck more than skill. Despite the hardships, Jory could not give up. Hunger was a cruel master, stronger than fear or pain. Each day brought a new challenge: a merchant's purse to steal, a locked house to break into, or a rich noble to shadow in the hope of finding unguarded wealth. Each day required him to balance audacity with caution, speed with stealth, and cunning with pure instinct. He had learned to read human behavior, to spot greed, fear, and distraction. He had learned to move silently, to hide in plain sight, and to vanish like smoke when the wrong eyes glanced in his direction. But no skill could protect him from the randomness of medieval justice. Guards could be cruel, lords vindictive, and punishment disproportionate. A simple accusation could ruin him. A false claim, a mistaken identity, or an angry neighbor could result in being dragged before the magistrate, publicly humiliated, or worse, executed. One evening, Jory found himself trapped in such a nightmare. He had attempted to lift a silver goblet from the table of a wealthy merchant. He thought the house empty, but a servant returning from the cellar spotted him. Shouts echoed through the halls, torches flared, and suddenly he was surrounded. His heart pounded. There was no escape. He was dragged into the street, the goblet clutched uselessly in his trembling hands. The punishment was swift. They tied him to a post, a small crowd gathering to watch. The executioner brought forth his whip. Jory's back was lashed, flesh tearing with every strike, and the jeers of the townspeople filled his ears. He tasted blood and dirt, smelled smoke from torches, and felt his spirit waver. He survived, barely, but the marks remained, a permanent reminder that survival in the medieval world was never certain. Even small comforts were elusive. Warmth, sleep, and safety were luxuries thieves could rarely afford. Nights were spent on cold stone, in damp alleys, or under the roof of abandoned buildings. Rats were constant companions, and thieves often suffered the bites and scratches that came from sharing space with vermin. Illness was inevitable. Hunger was a relentless companion. And yet the rush of stealing, the thrill of surviving another day, kept Jory moving forward. The life of a medieval thief was not glamorous. There were no tales of heroism, no songs sung in the streets. There were only survival, risk, and pain. Each day tested courage, wit, and endurance. Each night brought the possibility of betrayal, sickness, or death. And yet for those like Jory, it was all they had. The world had rejected them, and they had learned to reject it back. Even as he limped home one frostbitten morning, clutching his meager spoils, Jory knew the truth. It sucked to be a medieval thief, but it sucked even more to be a thief who failed. And as long as his heart still beat and his hands still moved, he would continue to take what he needed, slipping through the shadows, surviving as best he could in a world that wanted him dead. Weeks passed, and Jory learned quickly that surviving as a thief in medieval times required more than stealth. It demanded cunning, speed, and sometimes sheer luck. One morning he crouched on a rooftop, surveying a merchant caravan that had just arrived at the town gate. The wagons were heavily guarded, the merchants armed with daggers and clubs, but the promise of silver and fine cloth was too tempting to ignore. He watched for hours, noting the rotation of guards, the placement of torches, the moments when the merchants would descend from their wagons to trade. Every detail mattered. One misstep could mean imprisonment, flogging, or hanging. Jory had seen it happen. He had seen men of his own kind dragged to the gallows for a single mistake, their bodies swinging in the wind while the crowd spat and cheered. It was a grim reminder that life as a thief was a constant gamble with death. Finally, as the sun began to dip behind the timber-bird roofs, Jory made his move. He leapt from rooftop to rooftop, landing silently in the shadows, his fingers gripping the ropes that dangled from the wagons. He had memorized every movement, every timing, and yet, as always, his heart pounded like a war drum. He pried open a chest of coins, scooping handfuls into a sack he had carried for this purpose. The metals jingled softly, a sound that made his stomach clench not with fear, but with the knowledge that even this small victory could be stolen back from him by fate itself. As he prepared to descend, a shout rang out. A merchant had noticed a missing coin. The guards moved quickly and Jory's pulse surged. He ran, slipping through alleys, darting past open doorways, leaping over carts, narrowly avoiding collision with townsfolk. The chase was brutal. He knew every alley and shortcut, but the guards were relentless, and the clatter of their boots echoed through the stone streets like a death knell. By the time he reached the safety of an abandoned warehouse, his legs were trembling, his lungs burned, and the sack of coins felt heavier than ever. He sank to the ground, panting, and allowed himself a brief smile. He had survived another day, but the exhilaration was tinged with dread. Every theft could be his last. Every success carried the weight of inevitable failure, punishment, or betrayal. The medieval world was harsh, and thieves like Jory learned the cruelest lessons early. Human cruelty was as dangerous as any law. Rival thieves, hungry townsfolk, and corrupt officials could strike without warning. One misstep, one wrong decision, could result in a wound that festered, a trap that ended in public humiliation, or worse. Jory had friends once, but most had perished, been captured, or disappeared. Loneliness was a constant companion, only occasionally interrupted by fleeting alliances that were as fragile as the coins in his sack. One bitterly cold night, Jory met a young thief named Lisbeth. She was small, wiry, and clever, with eyes sharp enough to spot every opportunity and danger. Unlike most allies, Lisbeth had survived through cunning and skill, not luck. She knew the streets like the back of her hand, and she had a knack for finding weaknesses in even the most secure homes and shops. Together, they became a formidable team, pooling knowledge, sharing spoils, and watching each other's backs. But even partnerships could be dangerous. Trust was a currency that was often devalued, and betrayal was never far away. One evening, after successfully lifting a purse from a wealthy merchant, Lisbeth disappeared, leaving only a note claiming she had fled to avoid capture. Jory was left alone, haunted by the reminder that even those closest to you could vanish at a moment's notice. Hunger, cold, and filth were constant companions. Medieval thieves rarely slept indoors. Abandoned barns, church attics, and crumbling city walls were the closest they came to comfort. Rats gnawed at them, fleas feasted on them, and disease was always lurking. Jory had learned to live with pain, but sickness could bring even the most cunning thief to his knees. Fever, dysentery, and infection were more deadly than any sword or club. Despite it all, Jory continued. Survival was instinct, not choice. Every morning brought another challenge, another opportunity, another threat. He picked pockets, lifted coins, and stole food not for greed, but for life itself. He avoided guards, dodged rival thieves, and navigated the dangerous maze of medieval society, where even a kind gesture could be misinterpreted as theft. But one night luck finally turned. A wealthy noble, angered by the repeated thefts of his town, set a trap. Jory had been careful, meticulous even, but the trap was perfect. Hidden guards surrounded him as he attempted to lift a small bag of coins from an innkeeper's counter. He struggled, fought, but there were too many, and his escape was cut off. Dragged into the street, Jory faced the magistrate, the noble's anger plain in every furrowed brow. The crowd jeered, recognizing the thief they had feared for months. The sentence was swift: whipping, branding, and public humiliation. Jory endured it silently, counting each lash as if it were a coin, each sear of the iron as a reminder of the cruel world he lived in. Yet even as he bled, he survived. He would heal, and when the wounds were hidden beneath rags, he would return to the shadows, because being a thief, in all its misery and danger, was the only life he knew. It was a life of pain, hunger, betrayal, and constant fear, but it was life. And in the medieval world, life itself was a rare and precious treasure. Months passed, and Jory's life continued as a careful balance between survival and catastrophe. Each day brought the same bitter reality. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, disease threatened his body, and every shadow could conceal a trap. Yet he had learned, painfully, that even misery could be navigated if one stayed sharp. One evening, as dusk settled over the timber-bird rooftops of the town, Jory observed a wealthy nobleman returning from a distant fair. The man's carriage was laden with coins, fine cloth, and barrels of imported wine. It was an irresistible target. Jory crouched in the shadows, calculating, imagining the weight of the spoils in his hands. This heist promised enough wealth to last him through months of harsh winters, but it was far from simple. Guards flanked the carriage, mounted on horses that could outrun any ordinary man. One misstep, and he would be crushed beneath a boot, skewered by a spear, or dragged screaming through the streets. But risk was the life of a thief. Jory studied the route, noting a narrow alley where the carriage would slow, a bridge where the horses would hesitate, and a cart that could block the guard's view. Timing was everything. He waited, crouched atop a wall, listening to the hoofbeats echo through the cobbled streets. Heart hammering, he dropped silently into the alley, moving like a shadow, unseen yet entirely aware of the danger surrounding him. As he neared the carriage, he reached out, fingers brushing against the coin pouch. Success was within reach, then disaster struck. A loose plank underfoot gave way, sending him sprawling into the street. The carriage jolted, The horses reared, and the guards turned, eyes narrowing as they spotted him. Jory ran, adrenaline surging, leaping over barrels, vaulting across carts, but one guard was faster. The man swung a heavy club, striking Jory across the back, knocking the wind from him. Pain seared through his body, but he did not stop. Pain was a constant in his life. Survival demanded ignoring it. He darted into a narrow alley, heart pounding, lungs burning, sweat and blood mixing in the grime of his tunic. Behind him, the shouts grew louder. He could hear the thud of boots, the clatter of weapons, the anger of men who wanted his life more than the coins they guarded. Jory's mind raced. Every decision mattered. One wrong turn could mean capture, public execution, or worse. Hours later, he stumbled into an abandoned warehouse, bruised, bloodied, and exhausted. The coins were gone, carried off by the guards, but Jory was alive, and in the medieval world, life was all that mattered. He tended to his wounds with scraps of cloth, cleaned his cuts in cold water, and whispered curses at the luck that seemed so determined to betray him. Survival was fleeting. Hunger returned with the dawn, sharper than ever. His body ached from yesterday's escape, his back still tender from the guard's club, and yet he moved again because there was no choice. The world would not wait for him to heal. Every day demanded action, every night required cunning. The life of a medieval thief was one of relentless struggle, and Jory had grown adept at enduring it, but endurance came with cost. Disease, injury, betrayal, these were constants. Jory had friends once, companions who laughed at danger, shared stolen bread, and watched each other's backs. But most had died, fallen into traps, or vanished in fear. Trust was dangerous. Even Lisbeth, his closest ally, had betrayed him once, vanishing with a pouch of coins he had thought shared. In the medieval world, no one truly belonged to anyone else. Survival was solitary, and even fleeting companionship was fragile. One night, desperation drove him into a churchyard, scavenging what he could from tombs, gravestones, and unattended offerings. It was a grim task, but hunger made all morality flexible. A coin, a bit of food, even a discarded trinket could mean survival. As he crouched, the chill of the night sinking into his bones, he heard footsteps. Guards. He froze, pressed against the cold stone, heart hammering. A torch flared, revealing his shadow. He ran, stumbling over graves, cutting his hands on jagged stones, the sound of pursuit echoing in the still night. When he finally escaped, soaked and bleeding, Jory realized yet again why it sucked to be a thief in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just the constant danger, the hunger, or the disease, it was the knowledge that every success was temporary, every moment of safety precarious, and every day could be your last. Even survival was painful, exhausting, and uncertain. And still he could not stop. Survival demanded action, and he knew no other life. Weeks later, rumors spread of a new bounty. A nobleman, furious at the spate of thefts, offered gold for the capture of the town's most notorious thief, Jory. Guards were everywhere. Checkpoints appeared, and suspicion hung like a cloud. Even the streets he knew like the back of his hand felt dangerous now. Every doorway, every alley, every shadow could conceal death. The thrill of the chase had turned into a constant, oppressive fear. But Jory was clever. He used misdirection, decoys, and his knowledge of the town to evade capture. He changed his routes, stole under cover of night, and moved silently through the rooftops. He had become almost like a ghost present but unseen, always near danger but rarely caught, yet the fear never left. Every stolen loaf, every lifted coin, was tempered by the knowledge that one slip could end everything. The life of a medieval thief was brutal, lonely, and often hopeless. Hunger, cold, injury, and disease were relentless. Betrayal and death lurked at every corner. Public humiliation and corporal punishment waited for the careless. And yet, Jory survived not because he was strong or virtuous, but because he had no other choice. Life demanded cunning, endurance, and the willingness to endure suffering that most could not imagine. And so he continued. Every day was a struggle, every night a battle, every theft a gamble. The world was unforgiving, and yet Jory moved through it, bruised, battered, hungry, but alive. The medieval streets were cruel, but as long as he survived, he could continue. And survival, in a world as merciless as his, was the only true victory. Winter arrived with merciless cruelty. Snow blanketed the town in a thick, icy layer, and the cold seeped into every corner of the city. Thieves like Jory felt the bite of the frost more than anyone else. Their clothes were thin rags, their shoes worn to the point of uselessness, and the streets themselves were treacherous. The snow made movement slower, footsteps louder, and escape routes unpredictable. Yet survival demanded action. Hunger did not pause for frostbite, nor did death wait for warmth. Jory had heard whispers of a rich merchant caravan traveling through the outskirts of the town, laden with silks, spices, and gold. This could be the heist of a lifetime, but the risks were deadly. Caravans were heavily guarded, often accompanied by armed mercenaries who would not hesitate to kill for a coin pouch. One wrong move, and Jory would be skewered by a spear or trampled under horses' hooves. But the possibility of wealth outweighed the fear. Hunger was a sharper blade than any sword. He watched the caravan for days, noting every detail. The guards rotated shifts predictably, the horses slowed at a particular hill, and one side of the caravan remained largely unattended while the merchants prepared meals. Timing was everything. On the night of the heist, Jory moved like a shadow, slipping from rooftop to rooftop, his heart pounding as the cold bit through his tattered clothing. He dropped silently behind the last wagon, prying open a chest with trembling hands. Gold coins clinked against each other, a sound that sent a thrill and a terror through him. Then disaster struck. One of the guards returned unexpectedly, spotting the movement too late for a warning, but not for alarm. Jory bolted, clutching the sack of coins, ignoring the sting of cold metal against his palms, and ran through snowdrifts, slipping and sliding, barely keeping upright. The guard shouted, and more men appeared, torches flaring, weapons raised. Panic surged, but Jory had no choice. He could not surrender. Capture meant brutal punishment, likely death. He dove into the frozen alleyways, snow muffling his footsteps but slowing him down. His lungs burned, his legs ached, and his hands were numb from the cold and the effort. Behind him, the mercenaries advanced, cursing and striking at shadows. Jory stumbled, fell, and rolled into a heap of snow, the sack of coins bouncing away, scattering its contents across the icy ground. He cursed, biting back pain, and scrambled to collect the coins while avoiding the guard's heavy boot. Finally, bleeding, bruised, and nearly frozen, he made it to the safety of a ruined barn outside the town. He counted the coins enough to last a few weeks if he managed carefully, but the danger was far from over. Even now the fear gnawed at him. One careless word, one curious neighbor, or one pursuer could undo him entirely. Survival was never certain, and the medieval world was merciless to those who relied solely on luck. Betrayal, too, was always waiting. A fellow thief, seeing Jory's haul, had followed him, hoping to claim a share, or take it all. Jory had learned to recognize these shadows, to anticipate envy, and to move faster than those who would betray him. That night, he narrowly escaped another attack. Fighting off the would-be robber with a dagger he kept sharpened for such emergencies. Blood stained the snow, but once again Jory survived. The life of a thief was a constant gamble, and the stakes had never been higher. Hunger and illness were equally relentless. Nights were spent huddled in abandoned barns, rooftops, or church attics, sharing space with rats and fleas, shivering beneath thin rags. Disease was everywhere. A simple cold could turn deadly when the body was weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Jory's stomach growled constantly, a reminder that survival was dependent not only on skill but on the harsh, indifferent world itself. Despite these hardships, Jory continued. Stealing was not a choice, it was a necessity. Every day required movement, calculation, and the willingness to endure pain. Guards, mercenaries, rival thieves, and angry townsfolk all sought to end him. But Jory had learned to navigate the dangerous maze of medieval society. Every theft was a negotiation with fate, every escape a temporary victory. One fateful evening, rumors spread of a public execution scheduled for a thief caught weeks before a warning to others who dared to steal. Jory knew he was walking the same line. Every step could lead to a gallows, a whipping post, or a cell where rats gnawed at bones. The medieval world offered little mercy for those who lived in shadows. In the following weeks, Jory planned one final heist, not for wealth, but to secure enough food and shelter to survive the harsh winter. He aimed for the granary of a local lord, a place heavily guarded but overflowing with supplies. Timing, patience, and luck had to align perfectly. He studied the guards' patrols, identified weak points in the walls, and waited for the coldest, darkest night to move. As he slipped into the granary, the air thick with the smell of grain and mold, He felt the familiar thrill and terror, the knowledge that one misstep could be fatal. He worked quickly, filling sacks with grain, rationing them for weeks to come, aware that the slightest noise could betray him. And then, just as he was leaving, a shadow fell across the doorway. A guard, alerted by some instinct or misstep, blocked his exit. Panic surged. Jory fought, striking and ducking, using every ounce of strength he had, but the guard was relentless. The struggle was brutal, blood flowing, hands bleeding, hearts pounding. Jory narrowly escaped through a hidden side door, collapsing in the snow outside. He survived, but barely. Every nerve screamed, every muscle ached, and yet he had the grain he needed to endure the coming weeks. This was the life of a medieval thief. Constant danger, relentless hunger, betrayal, disease, and the shadow of death looming at every corner. Pain and fear were normal. Survival was miraculous. Yet Jory pressed on. Even battered, bruised, and exhausted, he moved through the streets, invisible yet always watched, living in a world that sought to destroy him simply for existing. It truly sucked to be a medieval thief. There were no safety nets, no laws to protect you, no mercy for mistakes. Every day was a gamble, every night a struggle against cold, hunger, and violence. And yet for those who lived by cunning, endurance, and desperation, there was a strange exhilaration, a proof that even in the harshest world, survival was possible. Jory had survived. And as long as he breathed, he would continue. Spring arrived, and with it, a new wave of dangers. The snow had melted, leaving the streets slick with mud and filth. The town smelled of rot, stale beer, and the refuse of countless people too poor or careless to manage it. For Jory, the change in seasons did little to ease the constant stress of survival. In fact, the thaw made travel more treacherous. Mud slowed his movements, and the town's drainage ditches, full of waste and debris, hid hazards and enemies alike. But spring also brought opportunity merchants returning from fairs, noble estates receiving shipments, and celebrations that left purses and pouches momentarily unguarded. Jory had grown cautious, almost paranoid. Every alleyway, every shadow, and every passing stranger was a potential threat. His skills had sharpened over years of survival. He could read the movements of guards, anticipate patrols, and identify weaknesses in doors and windows. Yet even mastery could not eliminate risk. One miscalculation, one moment of carelessness, and death was waiting. It was on one such morning, under a gray, heavy sky, that Jory spotted a caravan of spices and silks, guarded lightly as the merchants argued over prices and deliveries. The sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and silk threads gleamed in the sunlight, a fortune for a thief who knew how to move unseen. He crouched behind a wagon, calculating the timing, watching the guards shift and converse, waiting for the perfect moment. Hours passed, his body aching, hunger gnawing at his stomach, but patience was essential. Finally, the moment arrived. Jory slipped between the wagons, pried open a crate, and began stuffing his sack with coins and small valuables. The thrill surged through him, the adrenaline masking the cold, the hunger, the fatigue. But fate, ever cruel, had other plans. A rival gang of thieves, led by a man named Garrett, spotted him. They had been watching the same caravan, hoping to claim it for themselves. Jory barely had time to react. He bolted, racing through the muddy streets, with Garrett and his men in pursuit. Stones and debris flew as the chase erupted into chaos. Jory ducked through narrow alleys, vaulted over fences, and slipped through hidden passageways known only to those who had survived the streets as long as he had. The pursuit was brutal. Garrett was faster than Jory anticipated, catching up and swinging a club that narrowly missed his head. Jory felt the sting of the blow graze his shoulder, blood mixing with the mud and sweat that already coated his body. But surrender was not an option. If Garrett caught him, he would not simply rob Jory, he would kill him, leaving his body to rot in the alleys. Hours later, battered, bruised, and bleeding, Jory ducked into an abandoned warehouse, hiding among crates and broken furniture. He counted the spoils he had managed to retain, barely half of what he had hoped for, but enough to survive. His chest heaved, lungs burning, hands trembling, yet the relief of temporary safety was overwhelming. Survival had once again required cunning, speed, and sheer luck. But luck was fleeting. Over the next weeks, Jory faced disease, hunger, and betrayal repeatedly. A friend he had trusted stole a portion of his coins, leaving him to scramble for scraps of food. Illness struck, fever leaving him delirious and vulnerable. The streets of the town were unforgiving, each alleyway a potential trap. The guards' patrols had increased in response to the rash of thefts, and every encounter with them threatened punishment or death. Jory had seen what the law did to those less fortunate. Public floggings, mutilations, and hangings were common. Thieves were branded, ears cut off, or limbs broken as a warning to others. There were no trials, no justice, only spectacle and cruelty. Witnessing these punishments reinforced the harsh truth. The life of a thief in medieval times was a constant brush with death. Every theft, every step, every decision could be the last. One night, a chance encounter nearly ended him. Jory had infiltrated the manor of a minor lord, hoping to lift a small pouch of coins left unattended. He had been careful, but a guard, more vigilant than most, discovered him. What followed was a desperate scramble through the corridors of the manor, dodging torches, guards, and sharp-edged furniture. He tumbled down a flight of stairs, cutting his hands and scraping his knees, yet he did not stop. Adrenaline carried him into the night, and he vanished into the darkness, leaving his stolen prize behind. Pain, fear, and hunger were constants, but they were not the worst part of Jory's life. The cruelest aspect was the isolation. Trust was impossible, friendship fragile, and love dangerous. Those who sought companionship often brought betrayal or danger. He had learned to keep others at a distance, to rely on no one, and to carry the burden of survival alone. Loneliness was a shadow that followed him through every heist, every escape, every night of shivering beneath cold roofs or in dank alleys. Yet, despite it all, Jory endured. Survival demanded it. Hunger, cold, disease, guards, rival thieves, betrayal, and brutal punishment shaped every decision, every movement, every heartbeat. He had become a shadow in the medieval town, feared by some, despised by all, yet alive in a world that often sought to end him. The life of a medieval thief was misery made flesh, a constant cycle of danger, deprivation, and fear. Yet Jory persisted. Each narrow escape, each stolen coin, each moment of survival reinforced a simple truth. It truly sucked to be a medieval thief, but worse still was the alternative death, captured and displayed for the amusement of the masses. And so he moved through the town, ever vigilant, ever hungry, ever in pain but alive. In a world that offered no mercy, no justice, and no comfort, survival itself was the greatest triumph. By midsummer, the town had grown restless, and so had Jory. Months of near misses, betrayals, and constant hunger had sharpened his skills but also drained him. He knew that if he wanted to survive another year, he needed a heist bigger than any before, a score that could sustain him through winter and finally give him a moment of safety, however brief. He had heard rumors of a wealthy baron who stored gold and jewels in a fortified manor on the outskirts of town, guarded day and night by armed men and dogs. It was dangerous beyond imagination, yet the potential reward was irresistible. For weeks, Jory planned. He mapped the manor from hidden vantage points, noted the guards' rotations, memorized the pathways through the surrounding woods, and even observed the dog's feeding schedule. He relied on patience, stealth, and the careful study of human behavior. One mistake, one misstep, could mean a gruesome death, hanging, beheading, or worse. But he could not afford hesitation. Hunger and desperation forced him forward. On the night of the heist, Jory crept along the manor's perimeter, heart hammering in his chest. The moon was hidden behind clouds, offering darkness but also uncertainty. He slipped past the outer fence, avoiding the sharp eyes of patrols and the low growls of the dogs. Every step was precise, calculated, a dangerous dance with death. The life of a thief demanded such precision. Miscalculations were fatal. Inside the manor, Jory navigated hallways lined with tapestries and oil lamps, every shadow a potential threat. He reached the treasure chamber and paused, hand trembling as he pried open the lock. The sight of gold, silver, and jewels was breathtaking, so much wealth that a lifetime of poverty could be erased in a single night. He filled his sack quickly, silently, knowing that any sound could betray him. Then came betrayal, the cruelest part of a thief's life. One of his old allies, a man named Garrett, who had haunted Jory's past with envy and resentment, had tracked him. Garrett appeared at the doorway, dagger in hand, eyes blazing. "Thought you'd have all the fun, eh?" he hissed. Jory's heart sank, knowing the fight would be brutal. There was no room for negotiation, only survival. The confrontation was savage. Jory fought with everything he had, Every muscle, every instinct honed over years of dodging guards, rival thieves, and fate itself. Garrett lunged, swung, and cursed, but Jory dodged and struck, using his knowledge of the room to his advantage. They grappled in the dim light, knocking over crates and scattering coins across the floor. Blood mingled with sweat, hearts pounded, and the sound of clashing metal echoed through the chamber. Finally, Jory gained the upper hand, forcing Garrett back and securing the sack of treasure. But escape was far from guaranteed. Guards had been alerted, torches flared, and shouts filled the manor. Jory bolted, weaving through the corridors, vaulting over furniture, and slipping into hidden passages he had memorized. Every second was a battle against time, every step a gamble with death. He reached the outer courtyard, breath ragged, body bleeding yet alive. The guards pursued, but Jory had planned for this. Using the shadows and the narrow streets of the town, he disappeared, leaving the guards bewildered and empty-handed. The heist, though perilous, was a success. For the first time in months, Jory had a chance to rest, to eat, to survive without immediate threat, though the danger never truly disappeared. Even in triumph, the medieval world was unforgiving. Public executions, disease, hunger, and betrayal were constants. Thieves were treated as vermin, punished harshly, and remembered only for the spectacle of their failures. Jory had seen friends broken, maimed, or killed for mistakes smaller than the ones he had survived. Survival was never guaranteed, and every stolen coin carried the risk of mutilation or death. Yet he persisted. The life of a thief was brutal, lonely, and exhausting, but it was the only life Jory knew. Hunger, disease, pain, betrayal, these were constants. Fear was constant. Yet so was the thrill of survival, the rare victories, the stolen moments of warmth or food. Each day required cunning, courage, and endurance beyond what most could imagine. Jory had become a master of shadows, a survivor in a world that sought to destroy him. Every heist, every escape, every scar told the story of a man who had refused to die despite overwhelming odds. It sucked to be a medieval thief. Every moment was a gamble with life, but for Jory, it was also proof that even in the harshest, cruelest world, survival was possible. And so, bruised, battered, hungry, but alive, Jory moved through the town once more. The streets were filthy, the law cruel, and the world indifferent, but he survived. And survival, in the medieval world, was the greatest triumph a thief could ever know. By late summer, the town had grown increasingly hostile. Rumors of Jory's heists had reached the ears of the magistrate, who grew desperate to make an example of him. Posters of a wanted thief were nailed to every post, guards prowled every street, and bounty hunters searched every alley. Jory knew the noose was tightening. Every step outside his hideout could lead to capture, mutilation, or death. The medieval world was unforgiving, and even a single slip could mean the end. Desperation forced him to plan his most daring act, yet not for wealth, but for survival. The Baron's fortified granary, stocked for the approaching harvest, became his target. It was heavily guarded, but if he could slip in, steal enough supplies to last the winter, and vanish, he might finally buy himself a measure of safety. Hunger and cold had been relentless teachers, and Jory was unwilling to succumb without one final gamble. On the night of the heist, the town lay quiet under a heavy fog. Jory moved silently through the shadows, heart hammering, ears straining for the slightest sound. Guards patrolled in predictable patterns, but he could not afford error. One slip, one creak, one glance, and the punishment would be brutal. He slipped into the granary's yard, using hidden gaps in the fence, and crept toward the storage sheds. The smell of grain and wood filled his nose, the promise of survival within reach. Then came betrayal, the cruelest twist of fate. Garrett, the rival who had haunted him for months, had been waiting, tipped off by one of the Baron's men who had recognized Jory's face. "Thought you could get away again, eh?" Garrett snarled, blocking the exit. Jory's heart sank. There was no room for negotiation. Survival demanded cunning, speed, and the willingness to fight with everything he had. The confrontation was savage. Garrett lunged with a dagger, striking at Jory's shoulder. Pain flared, but Jory dodged, slashing with a small blade of his own. They grappled in the dimly lit granary, knocking over sacks of grain, sending coins skittering across the floor. The struggle was desperate, every move a gamble with death. Outside, guards began to hear the noise, their torches casting long shadows through the windows. Jory's mind raced. There was only one way out: use the granary itself. With a desperate heave, he sent a stack of sacks toppling onto Garrett, pinning him momentarily. Seizing the opportunity, Jory grabbed his loot and bolted through a hidden side door he had discovered during reconnaissance. Mud and grain coated his tunic. His hands were cut and bleeding, and every nerve screamed with fear and exhaustion. Yet he ran. The pursuit was relentless. Guards chased him through narrow streets, dogs snapping at his heels, the clamor of boots echoing in the town square. Jory slipped into the rooftops, vaulted over fences, and ducked through alleys only he knew. The city seemed alive with danger, every shadow a potential death trap. Yet the thrill of survival, of narrowly escaping certain death once again, carried him forward. Finally, exhausted, bleeding, and gasping for breath, Jory reached the outskirts of town. He collapsed behind a low stone wall, clutching the stolen grain, coins, and valuables that would keep him alive through the winter. His body ached, his hands trembled, and his clothes were tattered and soaked. Yet he had survived. The medieval world was cruel and merciless, especially to thieves. Hunger, disease, betrayal, and brutal punishment were constants. Even minor mistakes could lead to death, and public humiliation was a tool used to terrify others. Jory had faced all of it, clubbed by guards, chased through streets, betrayed by friends, and nearly executed more times than he could count. Survival required cunning, endurance, and a willingness to endure suffering that few could imagine. And yet he persisted. Despite the pain, fear, and exhaustion, Jory had survived where many others had perished. The stolen coins, grain, and treasures were not wealth, they were survival, the fragile lifeline that kept him one step ahead of death. Each scar, each bruise, each narrow escape was a testament to the harsh truth. Being a medieval thief truly sucked. There was no comfort, no safety, no law to protect you, and no forgiveness. The world offered only hunger, danger, and the ever-present shadow of death. But survival was victory. And in a world as brutal as the Middle Ages, living to see another day, to steal another coin, to escape another trap, was the greatest triumph a thief could hope for. Jory had endured every cruelty, every betrayal, every near-death experience, and he had survived. That was all that mattered. As dawn broke over the town, Jory vanished into the forest beyond the walls, the stolen treasures clutched in his hands. Behind him, the medieval streets slowly came to life, indifferent to the struggles of one more thief. Ahead of him lay hunger, danger, and uncertainty, but also life. He had survived the impossible, endured the unimaginable, and lived to see another day. It sucked to be a medieval thief. It always had, and it always would. But for Jory, survival was sweeter than any coin, more valuable than any jewel, and worth every scar, every cut, every terrifying moment spent dancing with death in the shadows. And that was the harsh, brutal, and undeniable truth of his life. We've now reached the story's climactic resolution, showing Jory's ultimate survival and why being a medieval thief was miserable, dangerous, and relentless. After that narrow escape, Jory spent weeks hiding in the outskirts of the town, moving between abandoned cottages and overgrown barns, eating what little he could scavenge or steal from the few farms he dared approach. Even these quiet moments were tense. Every creaking roofboard, every rustle in the bush could mean discovery. The medieval world had no mercy for thieves. Disease, hunger, betrayal, and violent punishment were constants, and Jory had already learned that any false step could end in a whipping, mutilation, or public execution. Yet, the need to survive forced him back into the streets. Hunger was a relentless companion, gnawing at his gut, turning his thoughts to desperate acts. One afternoon, he slipped into the marketplace, scanning for unattended purses or baskets of food. A distracted fruit seller, arguing loudly with a customer, provided the perfect opportunity. Jory's hands moved like lightning, snatching a small coin purse and a few apples. He vanished into the crowded alleys before anyone noticed. It was a minor victory, but in the medieval world, every victory mattered. The life of a thief was not just about stealing, it was about reading people, understanding patterns, and predicting danger. Jory had learned to anticipate guards' movements, to spot jealousy in fellow thieves' eyes, and to interpret townsfolk's subtle reactions. The medieval streets were a chessboard, and he was constantly calculating his next move, weighing risk against reward. Yet danger was never far. One evening, Jory was ambushed by a gang of thieves who had been trailing him for weeks, hoping to claim his haul. The fight was brutal. Mud, blood, and sweat coated every inch of their struggle. Jory's dagger flashed, cutting across hands and forearms, and he ducked and rolled to avoid clubs and stones. He managed to escape with part of his spoils. But the encounter reminded him that betrayal and violence were never optional. They were survival. They were survival, hunger and illness adversaries. He contracted a fever from contaminated water while hiding in a derelict barn. His body ached, his head throbbed, and delirium blurred the edges of his reality. He bandaged his wounds with scraps of cloth, drank what little water he could safely find, and slept in fits, every sound threatening to alert guards or rivals. Even minor illness could be fatal in the medieval world, and Jory was painfully aware of how close he came to death. As autumn approached, Jory turned his attention to a wealthier district of the town, where noblemen's homes were stocked for the upcoming harvest festival. These houses were risky, the guards were vigilant, the doors strong and punishment for capture severe, but the potential reward was unmatched. He spent nights observing, memorizing routines, and noting the weak points and defenses. Every detail mattered. One misstep could mean hanging, branding, or mutilation in the town square. On a particularly dark night, Jory attempted to lift a pouch of coins from a noblewoman's home. He moved silently, using shadows and rooftops, hard hammering with the familiar mix of fear and exhilaration. Just as his hands closed around the prize, a guard's voice rang out, piercing the night. He froze, then dove through an open window, shattering glass and cutting his palms. Guards pursued him, torches flaring, dogs barking. Jory sprinted through alleys and rooftops, the sounds of pursuit echoing in the narrow streets. Finally, he disappeared into a hidden courtyard he had discovered weeks earlier. Bruised, bloodied, and exhausted, he counted the coins and sighed with relief. Survival, once again, had come at a high cost. Betrayal, however, always lurked nearby. One night, Lisbeth, his one-time ally, appeared with a sly grin and a dagger hidden beneath her cloak. "Thought you could survive without me?" she whispered, eyes gleaming. Jory's heart sank. Allies in the medieval world were fleeting, and even the closest companions could become enemies. The confrontation was tense, knives flashing in the moonlight, every movement a gamble. In the end, Jory outmaneuvered her, leaving her empty-handed but alive. Trust was a dangerous luxury, and he had learned that lesson brutally. Winter returned, harsher than ever. Streets froze solid, rivers iced over, and food became scarcer. Jory scavenged what he could, stole from poorly guarded homes, and rationed his meager supplies. Disease spread quickly in the cold, damp alleys, and every cough, every fever, reminded him that death was never far. His body was battered, his mind weary, yet he continued, driven by the raw, unyielding instinct to survive. The medieval world was unforgiving. Thieves were hunted, beaten, and publicly humiliated. Jory had seen men hanged, whipped, and branded. He had felt the sting of the whip across his back, the burn of iron on his flesh, the humiliation of being dragged through the streets. Each encounter, each near-death experience, reinforced the brutal truth. It sucked to be a medieval thief. There was no safety, no law, no justice. Only hunger, pain, fear, and the constant threat of death. Yet through it all, Jory endured. Every narrow escape, every minor victory, every stolen coin, and every moment of survival was proof of his cunning, endurance, and resilience. Life was brutal, cruel, and terrifying, but he had survived where many others had perished. In a world as merciless as medieval Europe, surviving another day, another theft, another attack, was itself an extraordinary triumph. Spring had returned, but the town was no safer. Months of relentless thefts, escapes, and rivalries had made Jory a marked man. The magistrate, frustrated by repeated failures to capture him, had ordered a citywide hunt. Bounty hunters, armed guards, and even desperate villagers joined the search. Every shadow could conceal death, every alley a trap, and every misstep could be fatal. Jory knew that his luck, which had saved him so many times, was wearing thin. He had heard rumors of a massive festival at the Baron Ez estate, a time when nobles would display wealth. Guards would be distracted by celebrations, and opportunities for theft would be abundant. It was dangerous beyond imagination, but Jory had no choice. Hunger and survival demanded action. If he could secure the Baron's treasury, he could endure the coming months, buy food, and hide from the law long enough to heal and rest. The night of the festival arrived. Torches lit the streets, music and laughter echoed, and guards wandered distracted by drink and song. Jory crept along the rooftops, heart pounding, every sense alert. He slipped into the courtyard of the Baron's estate, using the shadows as his cloak. The treasure room was heavily guarded, but he had studied the estate for weeks, memorizing every shift, every lock, every hidden path. Inside, gold, silver, and jewels glimmered in the candlelight. Jory's hands shook with excitement and fear as he filled his sack. Each coin was a lifeline, each gem a ticket to survival. He worked quickly, silently, knowing that even a whisper could trigger disaster. Then came betrayal. From the shadows, Garrett and a few of his hired men appeared, daggers and clubs in hand. "Thought you could take it all for yourself?" Garrett snarled. The fight was immediate and brutal. Jory dodged strikes, parried blows, and used the environment to his advantage, toppling tables and crates to create obstacles. The noise drew guards, their shouts echoing through the estate, torches flaring in the darkness. Jory's mind raced. There was no time for hesitation. Using a hidden passage he had discovered weeks earlier, he leapt through a narrow window, landing in the snow-covered courtyard. The cold bit at his skin, mud and blood soaking his tunic, but he ran. Guards pursued, dogs snapping at his heels, torches casting long shadows. Every leap over a fence, every duck behind a wall, was a gamble with death. Finally, he reached the outskirts of the estate, his lungs burning, hands trembling, body battered. Behind him, the chaos he had left in his wake ensured that the Baron's men were delayed in pursuit. He sank to the ground, panting, clutching the sack of treasure. Hunger, fatigue, and pain pressed down on him, but he had survived. The medieval world offered no comfort for thieves. Hunger, disease, betrayal, and brutal punishment were constants. Public executions, whipping posts, and branding were common. Jory had seen men hanged, beaten, and left to rot in the streets. Every near-death experience reinforced the cruel truth. It sucked to be a medieval thief. There was no safety, no justice, no forgiveness, only constant danger. Yet survival was possible, and Jory had endured. He had survived betrayals, rival thieves, guards, disease, and starvation. Every scar, every narrow escape, every stolen coin told the story of a man who had refused to die despite overwhelming odds. The life of a medieval thief was brutal, terrifying, and relentless, but Jory had conquered it, if only temporarily. As dawn broke over the town, Jory disappeared into the forest, the stolen treasure in hand, bleeding, bruised, and exhausted. Behind him, the streets came alive with ordinary life, indifferent to the struggles of one man who had danced with death and survived. Ahead lay uncertainty, hunger, and danger, but also life. Survival was the ultimate victory in a world designed to punish those like him. It sucked to be a medieval thief. There were no comforts, no protections, no law. Hunger, disease, betrayal, and death were constant. And yet for Jory, survival, however fleeting and perilous, was triumph. Each stolen coin, each narrow escape, each painful bruise was proof that even in the harshest, cruelest world, life could be wrested from the jaws of death. Jory trudged forward, battered but alive, his story a testament to endurance. The medieval world was unforgiving, terrifying, and unrelenting, but he had survived it all. And for a thief like Jory, that was everything. After the harrowing Baron's heist, Jory knew he could not linger in one place. Even with treasure in hand, the town was alive with gossip. Merchants whispered about the shadow thief who had struck again. Guards were vigilant, checking every alley and doorway, looking for familiar shadows. Jory moved cautiously, always in motion, always one step ahead, knowing that in the medieval world, stillness was death. He spent nights hiding in ruined cottages and barns outside the town, surviving on stolen bread, scavenged roots, and the occasional poultry he could snatch from unwatched coops. Hunger gnawed at his insides relentlessly, making every stolen meal feel like both a triumph and a necessity. The cold air of early spring cut through his thin rags, forcing him to curl against frostbitten floors or under wooden beams to survive the night. Every sound, the howl of a dog, the creak of a shutter, the distant clatter of guards' boots kept him on edge. Even small heists became life-or-death gambles. One afternoon, Jory attempted to lift a coin purse from a distracted baker arguing with a customer. A merchant's apprentice noticed the theft, cried out, and Jory had to dive through a window, narrowly avoiding a sharp wooden post that could have ended him instantly. Bruised and bleeding, he vanished into an alleyway, slipping past guards alerted by the commotion. Victory came, but it was costly. And it reminded him that even petty theft carried mortal risk. Disease haunted him like a shadow. Damp barns, rotting food, and contaminated water made his body a battleground. Fevers racked him, leaving him delirious and weak. One night, he woke to chills and shaking, realizing that he might die alone in a cold, empty barn. He forced himself to rise, wrapping himself in scraps of cloth, forcing his body to keep moving. Survival demanded resilience that bordered on obsession. Failure meant exposure, capture, and punishment. Rival thieves were another constant threat. Garrett, his old adversary, had resurfaced, stalking Jory with renewed determination. Their encounters were brutal, each fight a savage exchange of knives and fists, blood mingling with mud, and terror propelling them forward. In one narrow alley, Jory was cornered by Garrett and two of his men. He dodged strikes, rolled under a swinging club, and plunged his dagger into a post to disarm one assailant, escaping with both wounds and treasure. In the medieval streets, trust was a liability and betrayal a fact of life. Allies were temporary, enemies permanent. As summer approached, Jory set his sights on the harvest festival at the Lord's Manor. The festival promised distracted guards, wealth on display, and chaos to hide within. Months of careful observation went into mapping the estate, noting guards' routines and memorizing every shadowed alcove. Every detail mattered. One misstep, one raised voice, and death would follow swiftly, mercilessly, and publicly. On the night of the festival, Jory moved like a ghost, slipping past distracted guards and drunken revelers. Gold, silver, and jewels glittered temptingly, but he had learned that greed could be fatal. He prioritized essentials: coins for food, sacks of grain, and small valuables that could sustain him through winter. Just as he was about to leave, Garrett appeared, dagger flashing in the torchlight. The fight was savage. Tables and barrels crashed around them, splintering wood and scattering coins. Jory ducked, rolled, and used a hidden passage he had discovered weeks earlier to escape. His body ached, every cut burned, and yet he ran, the thrill of survival carrying him forward. Hunger and cold never relented. Nights were spent shivering beneath broken roofs or in damp attics, rats nibbling at his fingers and fleas biting through his rags. Illness struck repeatedly, fevers leaving him delirious, shaking, and vulnerable. Each recovery felt like a small miracle, each breath a triumph. The medieval world showed no mercy, and thieves like Jory had to endure every cruelty, every danger, and every deprivation. Even when temporarily safe, the isolation was crushing. He had learned to trust no one. Lisbeth, his one-time ally, had betrayed him once, disappearing with half his treasure. Garrett had attacked him repeatedly, leaving scars and bruises. The medieval streets were a battlefield, and Jory was a survivor, not a hero. Every stolen coin, every narrow escape, every bruised limb was proof of endurance in a world designed to crush the weak. By late summer, Jory realized he was approaching the limits of his endurance. Every heist, every flight from capture, every night spent cold, hungry, and alone, chipped away at his body and mind. Yet the drive to survive remained unbroken. Survival demanded cunning, patience, and relentless action. The medieval world was unforgiving, but he had learned its rhythms, its patterns, and its hidden paths. Every risk, every gamble was calculated, because failure meant death. And so Jory continued, moving through the town and its outskirts like a shadow. Hunger, disease, betrayal, and punishment were constants, but he endured. Every scar and bruise told the story of a life lived on the knife's edge. Every narrow escape reinforced a single truth: it truly sucked to be a medieval thief. There was no safety, no justice, and no mercy. Every day was a gamble with death, every night a struggle against pain, cold, and hunger. Yet through it all, Jory survived. And in the cruel, indifferent world of medieval Europe, survival was the greatest triumph a thief could ever achieve. Jory's luck finally cracked on a morning that began like any other gray sky. Damp stone, and the sour smell of refuse drifting through the streets. He had slept in a loft above a cooper shop, wedged between empty barrels, his body aching from old wounds that never fully healed. His fingers were stiff with cold, his stomach hollow. Hunger had a way of dulling fear, and that was when mistakes happened. He went out too early. The streets were not yet crowded enough to hide in. The baker's wife spotted him before he spotted her, and her scream split the air like a blade. Guards appeared from both ends of the street, mail clinking, boots pounding stone. Jory ran. He ran through alleys slick with filth, vaulted a low wall, scraped his ribs climbing a fence, and plunged into a tannery yard where vats of stinking liquid burned his eyes. A dog caught his scent and lunged, teeth grazing his calf. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but fear carried him forward. He burst into the river district, leaping between boats, slipping on wet planks, barely staying upright. A club struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He hit the ground hard, breath exploding from his lungs. Hands grabbed him, rough, calloused hands. Someone kicked his ribs. Another voice shouted for rope. For the first time in years, Jory thought, this is it. They dragged him to the square, where a wooden post already stood. He had seen it many times, thieves tied there, whipped until their backs were raw, branded, so everyone would know them forever. The crowd gathered quickly. People always came. Punishment was entertainment in a world with little joy. They tied his wrists above his head. His shirt was torn away. The whip cracked. Pain tore through him, white-hot and blinding. He bit down hard enough to taste blood, refusing to scream. Each lash burned, then throbbed, then burned again. He lost count after 10. The world narrowed to agony and noise and the smell of his own blood. When they cut him down, he collapsed in the mud, shaking uncontrollably. A magistrate stepped forward and pronounced his sentence: exile from the town. Return meant hanging. No mercy, no appeal. They dumped him beyond the gates at dusk, barely alive. Jory crawled at first. Every movement sent fire through his back. Flies gathered at the open wounds. Fever came quickly, shaking his body, filling his mind with half-remembered faces and fragments of fear. He lay in a ditch for 2 days, drinking from puddles, chewing grass, drifting in and out of consciousness. Many died this way, not executed, not formally killed, just discarded. Somehow he lived. When he could stand again, he limped into the forest. Life outside the town was no kinder. Bandits prowled the roads. Wolves stalked the weak. Food was scarce, shelter uncertain. Jory stole when he could apples from orchards, bread from careless travelers, but even this was dangerous. A farmer caught him once and beat him with a stick until Jory escaped bleeding and half-blind. Winter crept closer. His wounds healed poorly, leaving thick scars that pulled tight in the cold. His hands were always cracked, his nails broken. Lice lived in his clothes. Sleep came in short, nervous bursts. Every sound woke him. Every shadow threatened death. He thought often of the square, of the crowd's faces, of how quickly people cheered pain that was not their own. In the medieval world, thieves were not just criminals, they were warnings. Living examples of what happened when you stepped outside the rigid order of society. Jory understood now why so few thieves grew old. Years passed in fragments. New towns, new risks. Different guards, same laws. In one city, they cut off a man's ear for stealing bread. In another, they hanged a boy no older than 12. Jory learned to move faster, steal less, trust no one. He learned that the richest prize was not gold, but time one more day alive. One winter, starving and weak, he traded his dagger for a place in a charcoal burner's hut. Honest work, brutal and exhausting, but safer than the streets. For a while he slept without fear of the gallows. His hands blistered, his back bent, his lungs filled with smoke, but he lived. Sometimes when the fire burned low and the forest was quiet, he thought back on his years as a thief. On the hunger that drove him, the fear that chased him, the pain that shaped him. On how every stolen coin had come with blood, sickness, or betrayal attached. It had sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because of bad luck, but because the world was built to crush people like him. No safety nets, no mercy, no second chances. Steal because you are hungry, and you are punished as if you were evil. Survive by wit and speed, and you are hunted as a threat. Jory never became rich. He never became famous. He never became free. But he survived. And in a medieval world of whips, gallows, disease, and endless hunger, survival was the rarest treasure of all. Jory lived long enough to understand something most people never did. Survival was not the same as victory. Years passed, not cleanly, not neatly, but in scraps and seasons. Towns blurred together, faces were forgotten, only habits remained. Wake before dawn, eat when you can, trust no one. Keep your back to a wall. Even when he no longer stole, his body remembered how. His hands still moved quietly. His eyes still searched for exits. Fear had settled into him like an old injury that never fully healed. Sometimes in villages far from the roads, he heard stories about thieves. Men whispered about hangings. Women warned children that stealing led to hell. Priests spoke of sin and punishment. Jory listened in silence, stirring thin soup, watching flames dance in hearths he did not own. They never talked about hunger. They never talked about the way winter hollowed your bones, or how desperation crept in slowly, whispering that one small theft might keep you alive another day. They never talked about the sickness that came from bad water, the way wounds festered, or how fear followed you even in sleep. They only talked about crime. Jory knew the truth. In the medieval world, being a thief didn't mean living fast or clever or free. It meant living hunted. It meant bruises that never healed properly. It meant scars that marked you long after your crimes were forgotten. It meant knowing that one mistake, one slip, one witness, one unlucky moment could end your life publicly, painfully, and without sympathy. He had seen men die screaming. He had seen boys dragged to gallows. He had seen women branded, broken, cast out to starve. He had felt the whip himself. He had smelled his own blood on cold stone. He had known what it was to be less than human in the eyes of the law, and yet he had survived. Not because the world was kind, but because he was stubborn. Because fear sharpened him instead of breaking him. Because when the medieval world offered only cruelty, he learned to endure it. In his later years, his back bent from labor, his hands thick with scars, Jory rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes when someone complained about hardship, about hunger or unfair rules, he would look at them with tired eyes and say nothing. There were truths that could not be explained, only lived. When he finally died, it was not at the end of a rope or beneath a blade. It was quiet, ordinary, a cold night, a weak body, breath fading slowly, no crowd, no punishment, no judgment, just the end. And that more than anything, proved the point. In a medieval world where thieves were beaten, branded, mutilated, and killed, simply dying quietly was an achievement. Jory had outlived the gallows. He had outlasted hunger, disease, and fear. He had escaped a system designed to destroy people like him. It sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because stealing was hard, but because living afterward was harder. Because every day was survival, every night uncertain, every future fragile. And because even when you escaped the rope, the world never let you forget who you were. Jory's life was not glorious, it was not heroic, but it was real. And in the brutal, unforgiving medieval world, that was the rarest victory of all.